has gotten, it's gotten more formal. NUFFI applied to the city in 2018 to have a 1-year lease on the property. In the following year, we asked for 5 years. And then last year, they extended our lease until 2038. So we have a long lease on the property.
Nice.
In 2019, we took this loose collaboration and formed a board of directors, of which Mr. Spencer and Ramona are members. And Ramona's been a champion and dear friend since probably 2015, 2016. So she knows all the answers if I miss anything. But it's been a great experience to see what you can do in the city of Newburgh when everybody really wants to do something in the city of Newburgh. And it's been very rewarding for all of us to watch the growth of the organization, to see the farm become more beautiful every year, to see the willingness of people to come and work with us on this initiative, and to really build it out into the community, which will be our next step.
That's wonderful.
Ramona.
Good evening, everyone. And so we piggyback off of each other, right? So with Mr. Spencer, he didn't tell the truth that I gently pulled his arm and twisted his
You did.
It was gently. But in any case, I am so happy that he's here. Thank you. Ahmad, I think I've met him a couple of times now, and I'm just so overwhelmed by his humility and just how he just presents himself and his vision. And I'm just a believer in folks' visions one way or another, if I can be. Virginia, you know, I started with the NUFFI board a couple of years ago. Well, not even a couple now, but I think we're just under 2 years as a board. And we have been moving really quickly and doing very nicely. And when this opportunity came up in terms of, so I also am a Newburgh board member, and I serve on the library committee, and I serve on the library committee because I grew up always in the Newburgh Free Library. So I'm just a big fan of the library. And so I'm always on the library's calendar, looking to see, you know, what I'm going to participate in. And I came across this 2-session mini course, I'm going to call it, and was just thrilled by the opportunity to learn more about data. And, you know, my background is in youth development and in grant-funded programs. And we always, and in education, we use the term all the time, you know, informed by data, right? We're data-driven culture. And, you know, it's like, really, what does that mean? And so those are the questions that, you know, that's the question for me. When I saw this, I'm like, oh, I really get an opportunity, right, to learn more about analytics and really creating a data-driven culture. And so after the first session, you know, I thank you, Cynthia, you Leo, who just indulged me, right? And listened to me. And I yanked Yulia and yanked her up to the farm and said, I need you to come to the farm and meet Virginia. We're right, you know, Virginia's writing a grant, a federal grant that's due in on Friday of this week. You know, what do you think? And come to find out, you know, she is our neighbor, right? She lives in the city of Newburgh. How wonderful is that, right? Yeah. And so here we are, and just thank you so much for taking on NUFFI tonight as your case study, as we all learn more about, you know, data-driven culture.
Wonderful, wonderful. You're so welcome.
And saying that, we need to introduce our mentor tonight, and she is genius leadership, data-driven hacker,
Yeah.
Cynthia Marcello. Open
Yes.
Hub can be proud to have her as one of our leading mentors and co-partners, or like partner, real partner,
Yeah.
my personal partner. Incredible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I am honored to be here, and I'm honored to work on a use case that is so meaningful. A lot of times these use cases are business driven or, profit driven and things of that nature. And in this case, we're working on an organization that really is value added to the community. So when we talk about using data to facilitate that, that is actually driving change in the community. And that's what's very important. So value that comes from the use of data is measured in different ways. It's not just financial, not just monetary. Value comes from meeting the needs of your stakeholders. And the important piece is being able to connect the original questions that were asked to, and these are actionable questions, to the metrics that you developed, right? Making sure that you have the data that you need to assess that, yes, we did address the question. We're able to show that our actions translated into something meaningful. That's really the full circle. So it's an honor for me to participate on this project with you all. And I'm here at your disposal to answer questions and facilitate, and with the understanding that there's going to be lots of questions, and that's good, because when we work together, we collaborate and work together, we can get at the root of the problem and we can move things forward. So I just want you to know that I'm very, very happy to be here.
Awesome. And saying that, let's move forward and have our working session begin, because we do want to accomplish something, and we do want to have a lot of use of this for Virginia's grant. So she needs metrics, metrics, metrics.
Okay. So one thing that would be helpful to start off with is the data-driven culture worksheet that I shared starts out with defining action questions. Now, I would imagine, based on my experience with grants, is that there's probably things that they expect you to be able to measure. And they've provided that. So I think by working in the reverse and reverse engineering it, and starting with the expectation of the grant and going back to how can we develop questions and metrics to address those things, might be the best way. It would help me to know what they're expecting.
So the grant asks us to list out the goals that we hope to achieve.
Okay.
Exactly.
All
Then
right.
take those goals, put a timeline
Mhm.
to them, what will be delivered,
Yep.
what actions will be taken,
Mhm.
and how we will define whether or not we are successful
Yep.
in meeting the goals that we have set out.
Yep.
So
That's a classic model, by the way.
we know now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and they just threw in a little curve at the end and said, and how much funding is attributable to each of these
Yes.
pieces
Right.
you're doing.
Right.
So they can actually see that the budget is in order.
Okay.
So we basically set out 3 goals that we were going to reach out and identify and assess the population in the city of Newburgh that is most marginalized, and
Okay.
and basically people of color who have
Mhm.
no historically have had no interaction
Mhm.
in how things benefit them. So, and we've talked about this a bit earlier with Ramona, basically they are given what they get and expected to, that's good enough for the needs that they
Okay.
have. The second piece, that the second goal is to look at production, distribution, processing, all of the pieces of a food system,
Mhm.
and seeing how it effectively meets the needs of the city of Newburgh residents.
Okay.
What are challenges that are being put forward to keep people from being successful, maybe,
Mhm.
or what are some of the barriers from people participating in that food system in terms of being a grower
Mhm.
or being able to, if there's ordinances or zoning that prohibits the use of property for urban agriculture, or in Newburgh, we cannot have birds. So there is no poultry production or egg production for the city of Newburgh.
Mhm.
So we want to look at all of this, all the components of a really good, solid, healthy food system, and then look at challenges, barriers, and opportunities
Okay.
that will be there for us.
Okay.
And then
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
the third goal, because we are, slaves to goals.
Absolutely.
The third goal is to create a comprehensive master plan for urban agriculture for the city of Newburgh.
Mhm.
And I just want to make sure that people understand we are not replacing the comprehensive plan that the city of Newburgh is responsible for at the Department of Planning and Economic Development. What we are doing is looking at these issues related to urban agriculture
Okay.
and then putting together a plan that can be included in the overall master plan for the city. So
Okay.
it would be a component. So part of the master plan looks at parks and recreation. There would be part of the master plan, then depending upon what we can come out of with this funding, that would look at what are the issues of urban agriculture for it to be successful in the city of Newburgh.
Mhm. Okay. All right. So what you're talking about is systems thinking, which is something that I thrive on. Um, so really where it starts is the food system is the core. That's the central component. And so in order to be able to do anything pursuant to it, you have to define it. And so what is one of the questions you want to be thinking about is what is an adequate food system? What is it comprised of? What are its components? Once you have those pillars, those core areas of a food system, then within each of those core elements, you can define variables of interest, ask specific action questions, develop metrics, and then measure those metrics. Does that make sense?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay, so if you think of a food system as, the center of a wheel, right? All the spokes emanating from it are going to be important components of it. So the pillars, as it were. And if I were you, I'd keep it simple, maybe come up with 5 that are core, core elements that are the pillars of an adequate food system. As a whole, as a system, you'll be able to assess whether or not that food system is adequate. But within that food system, all the separate subsystems are the spokes that are emanating from the core, right? So one way of looking at it is our food system, or an adequate food system, is comprised of these core subsystems. What are they? Define them. And then within those, you're going to have elements that need to be addressed within each of those. So I think the big thing is, what are those core subsystems that are within an adequate food system? And you may not have the answers off the get-go. This can be a brainstorming session where we kind of take notes and discuss, because without those core elements, you're not going to be able to determine the extent to which each of those is meeting the needs. Each one of them, just so you know, will serve as a separate entity that can be measured separately and together, right? And the benefit of that is you have an entire system that is measured as a whole, right? But you also have the subsystems, and it allows you to invoke change or bring in modifications, interventions if you need to. If you see a subsystem in need of improvement, you can address it at the subsystem level, recognizing that it still is connected to the larger system, right? So an impact of the subsystem will impact the overall. So if one of those core elements are, having issues or doing really well, it goes in both directions, right? Positive or negative. You will see change in the overall system, positive or negative. So it works together. And that's the whole idea of a system in good state, right? All the subsystems are working correctly, almost like the body, right? If one of the subsystems is having trouble, then that will have an impact on the other. subsystems, but the goal is to intervene as soon as possible.
Right.
Right. So what are your thoughts?
So I could give you the typical
Okay.
food system components. So it
Mhm.
starts with production,
Mhm.
moves to distribution.
Mhm.
There's processing.
Yep.
And then, of course, there's the actual access of
Yep.
that food
Mhm.
by the people that you seek to feed or
Mhm.
whatever. So you basically have, you have to be able to produce it, distribute it, process it, and get it out to the market.
Right. And if I were to look at that from a linear point of view, production is first, then processing, then distribution, then access.
Well, sometimes.
Okay. So if it's not linear, we have to factor that in. So you understand what I'm saying? In other words, if there's dependencies from one area to the next, and you identify, so for example, one of the dependencies of processing is that the production meets the quotas, meets the actionable items that you've identified, meets the goals, right? If goals are not met in production, that will have an impact on processing and subsequently, right, distribution, and then subsequently access. So in some cases it's linear, in some cases it's going to be curvilinear. So understanding those is going to be important. It's just something to have on your mind when we're phrasing questions, right? Because if you ask one question and there's a dependency, or if it's dependent on something above it, one answer then leads into the next one. So
Is it okay? We have 4 pillars so far.
yes.
Production, distribution, processing, and accessing.
Yep. Yep. Which is good. It follows the, keep it simple, logical, right? Now, the other thing to think about, if that's the classic food system model, and you are, let's say the emphasis of your model is on urban, right? Is there any differentiation that would benefit the overall system? In other words, there's an argument that, well, if we apply the classic model to our system, it doesn't quite fit, or it needs to be adjusted in some way, because it's not suiting the needs of our constituents, of our stakeholders. So rather than worry about a rigidity, is there a need for flexibility, or does 4 pillars cover it and that's it? And again, I'm just asking the question because, sometimes we have to change the paradigm to meet the needs of the stakeholder.
I think if we were to take each of the 4 components apart, there would be things that are specific to agriculture, and then there are the items that might be specific to trying to produce food in an urban environment.
Okay, but there's no add-on that you see that is a leg that is absolutely necessary. Okay, so that's actually a good thing, because we don't add complexity, right? This works. It's customizing the classic model, which is fine. All right. So now that we have those 4 pillars, what we would want to do is we would want to focus on questions. So last week I had given out the data-driven framework, and one of the first things we started out with was defining your action questions. So within each of those pillars, we would want to define action questions, and they may be very general, and if they are, we're going to have to tighten them up. So, and it could be something as simple as, something related to production that perhaps you deem relevant, important, something that should be actionable in production. And we're starting with that one only because that's really where things start.
So the questions on production in an urban setting especially is, where do you grow the food? Because
Okay.
there's limited land.
Okay, so if you're going to turn that into something data driven, right? Are you planning on collecting data related to that location, or is it simple as asked and answered? Because if you're, so let's say, and I'll just throw this out there, and I could be way off base, but just something to think about. Let's say we have the opportunity to grow in 3 locations. We're that blessed, right? We've been given an opportunity. And the goal, of course, is to produce a yield that is going to meet the needs of the stakeholders. And we now want to gather metrics related to specific locations with respect to, soil quality and air quality and whatever it is that is important to the yield. Do we have questions specific to that, or is it just where's the location? You see what I'm saying? So there's.
Right. But in an urban setting, there may be different types of growing settings.
Right.
So it's not just based on land.
Right. And I'm thinking environmental, there's a whole gamut. So let me ask it a different way. And this is specific to production, you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. So let's think about it this way. Regardless of location, what variables of interest, what is important to each and every location? In other words, what would you want to measure to determine that performance was optimal? That, and I'm saying performance, it could be a whole bunch of things, yield and what have you. So what particular questions would you have about the given location to determine feasibility and or appropriateness?
So again, I think it would depend on where. So if it's an in-ground, like
Okay.
a garden or the farm, we do measure the environmental impacts on that.
Okay. Okay.
We look for sunshine, we look for water, how it can be sited.
Okay. So this is awesome. So basically one location will have one to many variables associated with it that are meaningful and will have an impact on output, on the result. Okay, so let's list those things.
Well,
what would you want to track, I guess? What would be the things that you would want to track?
For the city of Newburgh, we immediately ask for soil testing.
Soil test, okay. And is someone jotting this down? I'm handwriting, but you don't want to read my chicken scratch. But this helps me understand your system.
So because Newburgh has a lot of contaminated soil. So there's the soil testing.
Mhm.
There's is there enough sunlight?
Okay, so sunlight.
Okay.
Is it hours of sunlight?
Yeah, and which way the garden is going to actually be facing, all of that.
Okay.
There is the issue of access to water.
Okay, water. Okay.
I'm typing this in the chat as well.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So do you look at azimuth and things like that with sunlight? Do you look at that direction? How do you generalize direction of sunlight?
It's where it comes up in the morning and how much sun is on that piece of property throughout the day.
Okay. And you're probably shooting for 6 hours or more?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So then water access. Do you do a water test as well?
No, because we're in the city of Newburgh and we have good water.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Okay. So what else?
So the other thing in terms of production in a community garden, are there people to take care of it?
So what would you call those individuals? Caretakers?
Well, the growers.
Right. Growers. Okay. All right.
So
all right.
There has to be a group of people that want that garden and take care of that garden.
Okay. So does that equate to buy-in, or is that just do we have available, or do we have the resources, or is there a buy-in factor as well?
There's a buy-in factor.
Okay. So buy-in. All right. So we need we need the actual human capital, but we also need the buy-in.
Right.
So with buy-in, so when you start asking questions, you're asking questions from a question. So a buy-in could be then whether someone is willing, whether they're capable, whether they're all of those things, right?
Right.
I can want to do it, but I may have no clue in terms of how to do it.
That's correct. So here's the thing. It all ties back to what is the goal? right? So it ties back to the goals. If the goal is to assess the feasibility of garden A, feasibility then is a function of the soil test, the sunlight, the water access, the growers, and the extent to which I have buy-in. I would think if I have buy-in, then a secondary question would be, am I capable? Do I need training? Do I need, to be taught how to do this, right? So
Right.
you may have buy-in, but not have those other things, but that would be the catalyst for offering training.
Right.
That would be the right. So I think buy-in is essential. If you don't have buy-in, then the other things are secondary, right? So that's that dependency, right? But the other thing to think about is if you see a percentage of people polled, if let's say only 50% buy in, now you have an indicator that we need to raise awareness. Why do we not have the buy-in, right? How can we make people aware? And so that would be an indicator that if we don't have enough buy-in, and let's say your goal is to have 75% buy-in, right? And let's say it's less. Now you have a mechanism by which you see a need to intervene in some way, whether it's, campaigns to make people aware, what have you. Okay. So all of these things get asked separately. And you also want to be thinking about what the threshold of the cutoffs are, but that's later on. This is all great stuff here. Okay. So we have the human capital, we have the buy-in, and what else?
Then you have to have the financial resources.
Gee, that's always the thing, right? So the financial.
It's the
Okay.
financial resources.
Right.
Not inexpensive.
Did we forget the storing preservation as a component, as a pillar of this system, or it's part of the processing?
That's a good point. Because guess what? You can process and store elsewhere, but they're not necessarily joined at the hip. However, you could keep it under processing and just have separate metrics for that aspect of processing, if that makes it easier.
They were sharing the stories and cases when they were given some produce, and this produce was having only very short life.
Yes. So
cycle.
it's not like squash or winter squash where you can root cellar it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I would say that's, and again, I'm just saying myself, if you want to keep them separate, you can, but you might have processing and, storage, initial processing and then storage, short-term, long-term, something like that. It's totally up to you as to how you want to.
So what we're doing right now, we're just making notes. I understand it's really seems all over the place, but literally it is not.
It is
So
not,
we'll
no.
narrow it down.
Right.
And with this narrowing down, we will have the file, Google Doc file. I just did one of those shareable as a Google Doc with you, and we can collaborate on this.
Yeah.
I hope it is helpful.
Yes, and this is an iterative process, by the way. This is not going to happen in, an hour and a half. And just so you know, it may seem all over the place, but trust me, it's not. It's everything is vital and everything needs to be contemplated. And I think it's starting out super well. But it's not an easy, 1, 2, 3, and we're done. So that's something I would like to just share is, it's time consuming, but that's where we're here to help. Okay. So, all right. So financial resources. So, I'm going to assume that could come from a multitude of different sources. There may be, traditional funding sources. There may be non-traditional funding sources, right? Is there anything specific to financial resources that you want to break it down in different flavors, or just keep it at financial resources for now?
I think it's just financial resources.
Okay, which is perfectly fine. We're working at the high level, so that's perfectly fine. What other aspects of production? I'm thinking, and again, forgive my naivete, but but I'm thinking just the materials to do the production. So all those things that go into producing it, you've got seeds, you've got soil, you've got, natural pesticides, whatever you're using, composting.
Those are the resources, the financial resources, what you need them for.
I understand that, but do you want to look at any metrics related to those resources, quality of resources, availability of those resources? So here's where I'm going with this. If you have soil, sunlight, water, growers with buy-in and human capital and financial resources, but you don't have any seeds, or the seed quality, maybe the seed crop is poor, right? That is going to have a direct impact on the entire production system. So let's say you get seeds from a particular supplier, and it just so happens those seeds are problematic in some form. That's going to impact this whole pillar. So that's where I'm going with that. So the inputs, the process, these things process and render output, right? An input would obviously be finances, but also what you're putting into the soil, literally, right? So, and that's what I'm thinking.
So there are different kind of resources. There's
absolutely
resources, and there are the natural resources.
Right.
There's natural resources, but would a resource also be the time that a person puts in it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because if that gets subtracted out of this equation, your leg has broken, right? So think of it as this. I'm going to use a classic example that I use with my computer science students. You have inputs, you have processing, and you have output. So what we're describing right now are inputs into the system. The processing is once it's in the ground and it starts growing, it's right? That you have a process by which you will yield something, but you need to factor the inputs going into this system. So something as simple as, the seedlings or the seeds and anything else that goes into that. It could be materials for the purpose of growing that we need for production to happen. And those materials have to have a certain quality and availability. And let's say finance is tied to a lack of availability. Well, now we've connected those pieces. So we don't have enough of something to put into the ground because of finances, or because we don't have enough human resources to plant them, right? So now we're connecting all those pieces in the system or subsystem, right? So what inputs do you see? And we can make it, generic in that this group would represent all of the materials going into the ground, or as a subset of inputs that are important to this system.
But would even before getting into the ground, you have to have that initial preparation of the ground?
Oh, absolutely. That's an input. That's an input, right? So preparation is an input. If it's not prepared, then you can't put the seed in the ground, you can't process, right? So that is an input. I would submit, and again, forgive my naivete, but let's say you don't have human beings to till the soil, right? Let's say you don't have a lack of people to do that. Now you have a problem where the soil has to be prepared and conditioned to ensure that you're going to have that quality. So that is something that is part of that process. Yes. So would you want to say, as far as inputs, is there a general term you can come up with for that? And I'm thinking soil, or I'm sorry, not soil, seeds, seedlings, right? And again, assuming that we've prepared the ground, right? So we would have, I'm going to call it a plot of lands, we're talking about, right? So plot preparation.
Right.
And again, I'm using my terminology. You definitely want to use what you think is appropriate. We tapped into plot availability earlier by focusing on, do we have the location? So that's part of it, right?
Right.
So once we have a location, we have to prepare it. And then we need inputs to put into the ground.
Or we do the soil tests, do we have to buy the lumber to make the raised beds?
Exactly.
So we
Okay,
have, there are things that have to be determined along the way, depending
right.
upon
And
results of
here's
the.
the thing, that's exactly right. So right now we're focusing on the core elements, and then we'll do the linearity and the dependability, or the dependencies, right? You won't know there's a dependency until you actually have the things, right? And then you say, okay, in order to have this, then we have to have that. And what's kind of cool is you'll actually be able to diagram it out. And that's what's kind of nice, but we won't be able to add those elements to the diagram until we determine what those things are. And it might seem silly because we're kind of breaking down the production into smaller bits, but you can't measure it until you identify what it is, right?
Right.
So that's the thing. So, and we might think of more as we go along. So, so you mentioned lumber for the raised beds, right? Do you
Yep.
usually do seeds or seedlings?
We do both.
Both, okay. I had a feeling. So we'll just say seeds, seedlings.
So these are still inputs, right?
Yes, these are inputs, yes. Yep,
And if you're doing raised beds, you need soil.
absolutely, right.
You have to bring clean soil.
That's above, yep. And how about any composting mix, or you just want to put soil in general, whether it's,
Soil compost. Yeah.
okay.
Hay.
Okay. I mean, all of these are garden specific materials, I think.
Hand tools.
That could all be categorized as garden materials.
I would say, yeah, I would make a list of garden materials, because as a whole, you need all of them, right? So instead of making it, yourself crazy, I would just create a list of these are the common garden materials that we need. And then we can break them down further and get more granular if you need to. So garden tools, right? These are hand tools.
Any
They're
machinery?
hand tools, shovels. Yeah. Little hose.
Machinery? Any machinery? No.
No.
Okay, I didn't.
Is it by choice or by
Size. Just by size. The garden.
Yeah. If it's that small, if you take a rototiller and you kind of rototill things you weren't planning on. I've done that, actually. I confess, true confession. I rototilled something that was just not appropriate, and now you know the truth. I dug up some things I didn't want to. Okay, so yeah, I would make these simple lists. So, we have financial resources, we have garden materials, we have, these, keep them in convenient lists. All right, anything else that is part of production that you can think of at this point?
No.
Okay, do you use any kind of stone or anything in the base of the
No.
raised bed? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. And so there's nothing really else that you can think of. I think we have a nice list for production. We've at least got a good start. All right. So why don't we move to processing? Right. Okay. So describe processing to me. Processing is from harvest on.
Well, processing, yes, it's for us, it's washing the product. So as soon as it's taken out of the ground.
so harvesting and then
Harvest on. Okay.
And washing.
Okay. So washing. All right. And what else?
sorting, storing?
There could be some storing, sure. If it's a
Okay.
small garden, people take it home. If
Mhm.
it's like us, we store it in a cool place.
Okay.
But it also, processing entails the, if you have a shared kitchen
Mhm.
or someplace, if you need to cook the product to make it a value added product,
Mhm.
be distributed out.
So is
and
that, I'm curious then, would that then jump right into distribution then?
No, because
Okay.
processing is difficult enough without distribution. But if you do value added products, Then
Okay.
you get into the whole realm of the food permitting and regulations, both federal
So
and state.
packaging, is it a function of packaging? It sounds like.
It's the packaging, it's a you have-
Labeling,
no, it's what the Department of Health
right.
will require to,
Okay.
if you process something, and how you can process it.
Sanitate, all
And
right. So it sounds like a sanitation and health and sanitation.
you have to have the
Okay.
permits. You absolutely have to have the permits. So that takes you, if you go into
Permits.
value added, you're in a whole different world. If you do, basic harvesting, washing,
Mhm.
then just farmers market or distribute, you can't, you're on your own anyway. Then you have to
Okay.
have food permits. You have to be in line with the federal regulations.
Okay, so it sounds like you have two processing systems, if you will, one for value add and one that's not.
Right.
And when you start getting into value add, then you have to look at sanitation, health regulation,
Right.
and things of that nature. So it would be important to distinguish those.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. With permits and things of that nature. Okay, so, and actually, if you did not have those things, or you didn't meet the health sanitation standards, your value added part of processing would be nil. You wouldn't be able to do it.
Right.
So it's defining to that part of that system.
Right.
Question.
And we're if you are doing value, where does that happen? So we don't have a shared use kitchen in the city of Newburgh. You can do it in your own home, but again, you have to be permitted by the Board of Health.
So part of Board of Health is finding a location that's adequate, and they have to inspect it.
No, it has to be inspected. And
Yep.
even if the churches have kitchens, then they have to be permitted.
Right. Okay. So once you jump into the realm of value added processing, you have a whole subset of requirements that have to be met before any processing can happen in that sub of the subsystem. Right. So that's, yeah. So
I have a
Julia, you had a question?
Yes. Do you do anything about organic, non-GMO or something? Or it's not the part of this consideration at all?
So, right,
That would be on the input side.
right.
Yeah.
It would be value added.
Yeah, but I think if it was going to be organic, the soil would have to be organic, the seedlings, it would have to be the start of the
Whole
system.
process.
Yep,
Mhm.
yep.
The whole
And
system.
yeah. And there's actually, if you were going to be certified, then there's the whole McGill of that as well. So do you do that, Virginia, at all? Deal with
No,
organic?
we are not, or we're not certified organic. We use organic growing methods.
Okay, which is a value add from a marketing point of view, most definitely.
Right.
Right. So that's and here's the thing. And I'm just throwing this out there. Let's say that methodology, you are able to connect that to increased engagement from the community. That would then drive the need to get certified, because now you have data that shows that when we are able to do it organically, we are increasing the community participation in this, and therefore it would warrant going to that level of certification. So that's an important piece to look at.
Let me just say that unless you are a professional grower, and it might be something, if we proceed with this possibility of beginning urban farmers in the city of Newburgh, they may indeed want to go that route. It's
Yes.
very expensive
Yes, I know.
and time-consuming.
Yes.
For a community garden, it's highly doubtful that
Yeah.
they would go to certification, because there's too many members in the garden, number one. So the protocols for growing in the garden are set in terms of using organic practices, but you can't be certified in a community garden unless somebody's really in control of that garden.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So the feasibility aspect is something that for now is not feasible. However, down the road, if you have enough data to support it, it might open a discussion, which subsequently might change that paradigm. Yulia, I just sent a link to Jerry. Okay, there he
Yeah.
is.
So what I'm wondering about is, do we have to consider what the type of the organization is running this for-profit, not-for-profit, community garden? I don't know what other forms exist. Is it a variable in what end it's impacting our equation?
So are you talking from a data-driven point of view or on the, okay, from a data-driven point of view, it does not matter if it's nonprofit or profit, what have you. What's really essential and what drives this whole process is, what do we care about? What action questions do we have of interest? And once we define those, then we say what variables are related to that, and then how will we measure it, right? And what thresholds or what performance are we expecting, right? So when it comes to nonprofit versus profit, the system of what we're doing here is the same. And that's where it gets kind of interesting, if I can just say off the cuff here, is nonprofits will spend a lot of time in this type of process, and their passion and their love for the organization drives them, whereas in a corporate structure, money drives them. So they may be paid to do all of this, whereas we're taking the same process and applying it to nonprofit, because it's just as important, is what I'm trying to emphasize, if that makes sense.
Okay, it's not a variable.
Hmm?
It is not a variable, as I hear, but just because you mentioned community gardens have their own limitation, I thought about it.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. What I've seen of community gardens, we have a huge one on the campus, is there's not enough people, there's not enough resources to do this type of assessment. And it's unfortunate, but there's only so many individuals, and they may not have the knowledge, and yet they're just as worthy, right? They serve just a powerful purpose. It's just that they don't have those resources. So I think that goes back to, it's wonderful to work with, the organization here, because we can help, and we can change that paradigm. I think that's important. Yeah. All right. So anything else for processing? So we've got location. The value add definitely is a split in the decision tree there, and we'll have to define variables for these once we get to the other pillars. Should we move to distribution for now? We can always add more later if we think of something.
Yep.
All right, so let's talk about distribution. What things do we know about distribution?
Well, in a small garden, people take their food and go home with it. What we inject into the distribution is the issue of food waste.
Yep.
And if there's excess food, we have a program, a community-wide produce donation program. And we ask that if there's excess food or things that people want to donate, that it's given to this community donation program that we do. So that necessitates that either they can get it up to the farm, or we go and pick it up and bring it to the farm. And then from there, it gets repacked and distributed out to the pantries.
Okay, so there's a repacking process, transportation, we'll just say. Do you do anything with respect to composting, like scraps and things like that, or?
We only compost produce.
Right. Okay.
We don't do protein or anything of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious though, as part of this, do you teach folks how to, take the scraps and either reuse them, to regrow, and or compost? So let's say I take my vegetables home from the garden, I've got scraps left over. What can I do with those? Wouldn't it be more sustainable to, compost what I have in the flower garden, and maybe regrow that celery that I have the end, I can regrow it. Do we do anything like that?
Right. We do composting. We do composting workshops.
Oh, wonderful. Education. Okay. You
Oh,
took
yeah.
the word out of my mouth. Education workshops. Fabulous.
Well, there's education workshops all the way through this.
I had a feeling. Okay. You know what? So you answered that question. Excellent. So this is important because each workshop is an essential part of teaching the system, right? So
Right.
that is actually a really, really important part of the access and awareness piece. Because if people don't know and they can't get to it, right? Knowing how to do something is one piece, but then availability and accessibility is another. So they may think I'm not capable, and then they learn, oh, I am capable.
Right.
Or I don't need as much knowledge. It's not as mysterious as I thought, right?
Is it part of distribution pillar?
There's a workshop element to distribution, but also processing and production, and also access. So workshops are across each one, which is an important, you would want to, that's a feedback loop, a very powerful feedback loop. Because it is in each pillar, it serves as a feedback loop for the entire system. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah. It adds continuity. So it's both internal and external. So your staff internal, it helps them, but it also helps the stakeholders on the outside as well. Is there anything else in distribution that, is there any type of materials that you have to account for in distribution?
If we're doing it off of the farm, yes, we have boxes, clean boxes.
So we can say materials for packaging and distribution, that kind of thing.
Right.
Okay, packing. All right.
And especially with the with COVID over the last year or 2 years, nothing comes back to the farm in terms of our boxes going out.
So safe handling.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Protocols and that kind of thing. And actually COVID would, I'm not going to say interfere, but impact each one of these pillars, the entire system, right? So everybody's system got impacted. So yeah. Darn COVID, right? Yeah. Changes everything. Okay, so we have materials, the packaging, safe handling. Anything else that you can think of in distribution?
The need for storing before it's distributed.
Right, and so that was part of processing. Are you comfortable with leaving that there?
Yeah, as long as we have storage.
Right, so here's the thing, when you're processing it, if you don't have storage, then you have a problem with, waste and potential, right. So then you don't have to worry about distribution. So I think we'll leave storage and processing because you can't distribute that which you can't store or benefit from. So
Question
I think
about if you need any transportation tools.
transportation and distribution, absolutely. So I put down transport, but I'm going to assume that it may be, how would you transport it?
Basically, a lot of what's going on now is a lot of volunteer effort.
Volunteer. Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that. So here's the thing. Is it, would you say 80% reliant on volunteers? What would be the percentage?
It probably more than 80%.
Okay, then that's even, okay. So we have to measure volunteerism. Is volunteerism part of each one of these components or just the distribution?
Well, if you're putting the garden in, if it's a community garden, it's basically a volunteer effort. Everything.
Right. So right, and that's volunteer from a personal point of view, right? But so the production system doesn't die if you don't have volunteers. You're not growing anything, right? But from a distribution point of view, you would have people that did not necessarily participate in the production that may be doing the volunteer distribution. Does that make sense? Right. So that's a separate type of volunteerism is what I'm looking at.
Right.
Okay. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Because here's the thing, if you have things that need to be distributed, you don't have volunteers, that has a huge impact on both the, the stakeholders getting the product, but also not having more food waste than you planned on.
Right.
Right. Okay. And the other thing too, and this is just coming from me who who participated on a data-driven volunteer assessment, understanding the volunteer process and training people on the meaningful aspects of the volunteer process is an important piece. Yeah, and so what we found is, you know, individuals that didn't understand the system, didn't understand who was benefiting from it, they didn't understand the whole the mission. You know, there's a whole piece. So there is an educational component in the volunteer. If you have perpetual volunteers,
Right.
that let's say they say, I volunteer every year and this is the organization I'm going to devote my time to. Why is that? Right. So they're able to articulate it, but there's going to be some that can't. And that's where education comes in.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think you have to also, there's an assessment with the volunteers to make sure that they're assigned to the tasks they're most comfortable in wanting
Yep.
to do.
Yep.
That's-
Okay. So that's a classic volunteer survey type of deal to make
Right.
sure that they're matched and the whole thing.
And you
Okay.
check in with them to make
Mhm.
sure they're okay.
Right. Right. And also you probably, after each volunteer experience, do you assess them regularly, or how do you normally do that?
Basically, the staff person is there
Mhm.
working with them and talking to them.
Okay. To get feedback. And if there's something that was a little problematic, you address it right away. Yeah.
Right.
And again, that impacts that part of that subsystem. So if you see an issue that needs to be corrected, that would be the perfect place to do that. All right.
Right.
Awesome. Awesome. Is there anything else in distribution?
I don't think so.
We're doing too well on this. You realize this. We're really knocking this out of the park.
There you go.
This is very productive. All
Well,
right.
Well, can I intercede and ask a question? So,
Absolutely.
so in terms of creating, this food system, this master plan, the distribution is not just with NUFFI, it's also with other entities as well.
Right. Right. So here's the thing. We would take all of these common dynamics of distribution and apply it to multiple distributors, right, in their system. So what we're identifying is those things that are common to the distribution subsystem, regardless of who implements it. But the who is very important, as you've alluded to, right? So yeah. So if there's any differentiation, you would want to identify that too. So you understand what I mean? So in other words, okay, these are the things that are in common. This is where we branch off and it's different. And we need to account for that difference.
The difference can be that when the food is distributed to, let's say, help me, Virginia, to a location.
Mhm.
If that location has not depleted the food supply, then it gets redistributed. And if that's it, so is that a subsystem of
Okay.
how much is being redistributed back to NUFFI or someplace else?
So it's almost like the value added in the production side, but this is on the distribution side.
Okay.
So let's think about it. When we do redistribution, right, do all of the things we've already identified impact that redistribution process? I would submit probably yes. If it doesn't get redistributed, you've got food waste. It doesn't get donated. Someone doesn't benefit from it. You still have to transport. You still have to educate people about the benefit of redistributing, right? So things don't go to waste, right? And you're helping others. There's still safe handling because it's going from A to B, and you want to make sure that, it's done in an appropriate way. And there may be volunteers involved in that process because you need to get from A to B again. So it sounds to me like the distribution system has a redistribution, right? And there's a feedback loop within it, and that would be part of it. So redistribution is a very important piece, because how many times can you redistribute without having quality degradation, right? There's an aspect of that because it's a perishable product.
Right.
Right.
So one of the things that might be looked at that is a little different than what we're currently doing is if you identify a section of the city that has little access to fresh food, and there is adequate growing capacity in that region, that garden could grow for that neighborhood.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then the redistribution, they could set up their own little, come to the garden on Saturday morning and pick some vegetables up. But you don't necessarily have to have a bed there. You don't necessarily have to be one of the volunteers there. Maybe there's another community service you can provide. And for that service, you can come to the garden and get your fresh vegetables that week.
So that's a form of access, yes?
Right. That would put a form of access, but it's a different model for distribution, and why you would be growing that food.
Okay, so it's almost like you're creating a set of subplots for the purpose of X, and it's dedicated to a specific purpose. Okay, so I'm going to call that redistribution with dedication. And that's actually super important, because now you have a specific output, whereas before it's more in general. Now there's a very specific output with a very specific need. And so that's super important. Okay, so redistribution, just plain, and also redistribution with a designated benefactor.
Right.
Designated benefactor.
And that's the model, I think, that, and Ramona, please jump on me if I'm wrong, but if you look at some of the housing in Newburgh that has space, the people living in that housing could actually grow food for distribution to those apartments. If they got, a really good garden there.
If I can ask, what do you think the impediment is to that? You probably have some inklings.
Oh, God, no.
Where do we start, right? Where do we start? But I think this system will help allay some of those barriers.
Yeah, and I think what Virginia and I talked about earlier is engagement, community engagement, because if you have a system if you have a current system where gardens aren't your norm, right?
Right.
Or having access to fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, every week. When if that's not what then then that mindset has to be changed.
Right. So point of reference, it's a frame of reference that's different. So that goes back to education, I think.
And it also goes back to buy-in.
Right.
Right.
To buy in, I have to recognize that this is something that I may not know anything about, which, yes, then I need to be educated.
That's right. Okay. So which is an exciting part of that program, though. I would say distribution, but also that's a function of access. In other words, I could have access, I don't, and yet I have the tools right in front of me. And so, yeah, that's an important aspect.
And here is Ahmad making note in the chat.
Awesome. Okay.
And please read it out loud. Let's discuss this because it's part of the accessing.
Thank you. I will read it if you don't mind. Accessing part, teaming up with local corner and grocery stores to help with making the farm produce more accessible. Develop a newsletter to keep the neighborhood knowledgeable about what's going on. Starting local food co-ops, throwing events to get the community to come out and see the farm and the work that's going on the farm. Wonderful idea. Going door to door to also build relationships with individual community members. I'm thinking also, after school programs and summer programs, a lot of kids don't know that vegetables taste good, right? Or they might have been told that broccoli's horrible, and then they have some and they're like, wow, this is not so bad. I think that those are wonderful, wonderful ideas, Ahmad. Thank you so much. No, absolutely. I think this is you answered it perfectly. Yeah. And I think that's super important. It's just the education. I think a lot of folks are afraid to grow things. They're afraid to do something different than what they're used to. And maybe they think they have to be perfect. And at the end of the day, you could plan to grow something and have it not grow. It's a risk, but it's worth the try.
Maybe they're just not aware, they can think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And
absolutely.
It's also the layers of the education, because I think you mentioned it, you start in kindergarten, first grade, but if if the school is providing that, right, the kid is getting this knowledge,
That's right.
but if mama doesn't,
That's right. That's right. Right. We don't do that at home. Right. So I go to school, I see the hydroponic garden, maybe I do the greenhouse, and then I go home and I don't have that at home. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So I'm curious, do you want to look at family involvement, and that kind of thing? Oh, I think you're muted, Ramona.
There's a lot of layers of engagement.
Yes.
It's multidimensional.
Right. So in access, I would say that engagement is a big piece of that. Education, right? Awareness. And if you were to label the development, so we're doing data-driven culture. If you were to say we need to engender a certain type of culture in the community, what would you call it? Is it a growing culture? Is it a sustainable culture? Is it a food security culture? What would you coin that? What would that be? Because that's going to be your thing. That's going to be your shtick when it comes to that aspect. And maybe even part of your marketing down the road. But if you want to think about
it is sustainability. In Virginia and I, we were talking about this terms of the term food security / insecurity, where when you look at the number of food pantries and the amount of food, vegetables that is distributed, and I think this is what has to be measured and asked the question, how do you measure whether a community is food secure or food insecure? Because right now, the system seems as if it is a secure food system. There is a lot going on.
Guess what? I can answer that question for you. It's a classic model, right? They tell you, the FDA tells you should have a certain amount of servings of vegetables and fruits every day. So the question is each individual in that given household getting those servings? Make it simple. And if they're not, then we can basically say that a certain percentage are not secure. Keep it that simple. And it aligns with, it aligns with the metrics that are put out there, that you should have 5 to 7 servings or whatever it is, right? So it's part of that food pyramid. Yeah. And it's as simple as that. And that's something that, your average citizen could say, I don't. Even a child could say, I only had 3 servings of grapes today. Or in others, it's something that is an easy ask. It's something that would resonate with the individuals. And then you could measure that and say, X percentage of family, in this area are not food secure. And so if food security is a function of the fruits and veggies, and let's say it's just vegetables, right? You would measure just that aspect of it, but that would be an easy way of collecting the data and also measuring it. The other thing to think about, and again, I'm just throwing this out there because I'm a tech person, is you could very easily, create an app that allows, folks to report on how much vegetables they're eating per day. And you could even have a gamification and contests and things like that. That's down the road. That's part of, awareness and, training and what have you.
I think some of what goes into it is looking at the traditional foods that people eat,
right,
that will make it easier for them to say that they're eating
right,
their vegetables and so on, because we found after the first year at the farm, we no longer grew heirloom tomatoes,
right.
but we did start growing tomatillos, and we did the eggplant, and you know, this year we actually did okra for the first time.
Wow.
Collards and the greens, all the greens we could
Yeah.
possibly grow. And that made it really important for people who came to the pantries. They showed up early to get the food. But I think some of the issue is always going to be how.
I think it cut out.
Oh, she cut it out.
Yeah. Maybe a
Kids.
bad connection.
And yeah, the first year, the first year they did the summer feeding program in the city, and they went to all the parks and playgrounds, and they made sure they had, you know, lunches for all the kids, and the moms were giving the kids $1 to go off to camp and play, and the kids were buying potato chips on the way up
Ooh,
and not
okay.
eating the lunch.
Okay.
So I think there's always going to be some creativity needed
Mhm.
to assess whether or not people are getting the nutrients that they need
Mhm.
in their diets.
Would you
So-
say, if you were to poll people, that there's an honest answer, or what you want to hear type of answer?
Well,
Well,
and I think for myself, until I have a better understanding and there are better conversations about food access in the city of Newburgh,
Mhm.
I would like to hear from the people that we would like to engage in
Mhm.
the process.
Mhm.
Are we meeting their needs? And
Absolutely. Right. Right.
figure out whether or not there's enough nutrients or whatever, but first figuring out
Right.
what it is that they actually want to eat. And
Absolutely.
will they be involved in giving that information? And it will be interesting because the Orange County Department of Health just received a large grant from Aetna Foundation to work with the 2 medical facilities. And they're doing the physician's prescription program where kids will get, and I think it's just for kids, but they'll get prescriptions for fruits and vegetables.
Wonderful.
The
That's
doctor.
awesome. That's awesome.
And
So I
that's what-
think
yeah.
that's a valuable point, and knowing what they prefer, but
Yeah.
also, you know, it would be really a shame if you were offering things that they just weren't aware of. Like, you know, some people don't know what okra tastes like. They don't
Yeah.
understand, right? They don't understand what, you know, collard greens taste like, or they've never had that type of vegetable. So it could be, well, I've never had it, I don't know what it is, and you know, I don't like it, or I don't think I'll like it. Or it could be that, you know, okay, so do you think that that would be part of the education and awareness? In other words, reaching out to them and surveying to them as to what their needs are is needs assessment. So it's educating the system as to what is needed, right? And then
Right.
the system provides, okay, this is how you get what you need. So I see it as kind of twofold there.
Yeah, I'm not looking to tell people what they need to eat in terms of
No,
even the food pyramid. I'm looking for people to tell me what it is that would make their lives better if they had this type of food.
right. So I guess with the food pyramid example that I provided, if we were to determine that food security is defined as having eaten, let's say 5 to 7 vegetables in a given day, right? Let's say that's an element of defining what food insecurity is. If you have a certain group of individuals that are not eating that, are they food insecure? And so I'm thinking it from a different way. There's an argument that, you know, people are food secure, but we've given them all processed food, which is not healthy for them.
Right.
And so I would argue that, you know, that's not security. That's not good. I'll use a ladylike term. It's criminal to do that.
And Virginia and I talked about that, which is in the schools, you get a little container of the processed fruit. You get the fruit
Exactly.
cup and all
Right.
the juice. And
Right.
so then the question is, you know, what constitutes good measurement for me?
That's right.
Are
Right.
we measuring
Right.
how many lunches or breakfasts we're giving out, even though the food may not have been eaten,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
Are we measuring waste? Are we measuring the healthiness of the product? Are we measuring what people like? Because you can eat, if you like apples, you could eat 3 apples in one day, and you have
Right.
3 servings of your fruit, right?
Right. Right. Which is fine.
Which is
So
fine.
I guess I'm trying to understand then. So if the farm is one aspect of food security or insecurity, and measuring food security or insecurity is not necessarily just the farm aspect. So the metrics for food insecurity and defining what those things are different. This feeds into that, but they are different. So we have to define, how are we defining food security? And when you don't have that to a certain extent, now you're at the insecure level, right? And so I saw this as being, if we're looking at how does the farm serve, that system serve in that food insecurity or security question, right? The vegetables aspect is the one component,
Right.
healthy, plant-based, a certain amount of healthy, which we're defining as, vegetables, right? But there's also other aspects of food security or insecurity that have to be addressed, which would be separate than these pillars. Most definitely. Yeah. And I think it's important too to distinguish between processed versus not, because what the farm initiative is proposing is fresh, healthy, you pick it off the vine and you eat it. It's good for you, right? It's right. Whereas what's in the store is not. And maybe educating folks about, they might say, well, I had this processed, I don't know, pizza with some basil on it. So I had my herbs. No, not really. Try fresh, cutting them up and what have you, right? So
now you're the advocate.
Yeah,
You're
yes,
advocating for it.
right.
So what shall we do with all these? Okay, we defined all these elements.
Mhm.
So what's your recommendation? What the steps would be applicable?
Here's what I would recommend. You have a list of each of the items that fit in the pillar.
Mhm.
Okay. So the next step would be, what are our variables of interest? Because once you identify those variables, then you can say, what's our action question? Once you have your action question, then we can go into the framework, the spreadsheet that was provided. And for each action question, we would follow the steps in the template. So just so you know, the case study template, or I'm sorry, the regular template, not the case study, you would literally have a workbook for each question. Okay.
Any chance we can pick the most important question for them and just to give sample,
A sample?
literally touch up sample?
Sure. So why don't we look at the case study? I think it would be helpful if we looked at the case study, because that'll get us in the mindset of what we're doing here.
So let me ask you this.
Yes.
Ultimately, for this grant, the goal is to create a food system master plan.
Yep.
So if you said we have the 4 pillars,
Yep.
I guess what if we start from the end, okay, here's this master plan. What would need to be in that master plan to drive us to the next level? So this grant is a planning grant.
Yes, I understand.
Is pretty much, what is it we need, right? How do we create this master plan of everything?
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And the next level would be, now we have some recommendations, and we're going to write another grant to fulfill that, what we're suggesting. This is what needs to happen in the Newburgh community.
Right. So in the plan, they ask you to measure things. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So we have developed the 4 pillars of the plan.
Right.
Within each pillar, my recommendation is to pick at least 5 areas that you will measure. In other words, these are 5 measurable outcomes that we expect from production, from processing, from distribution, and access. All right. And start with 5. If you can do more would be better, but at least you start with 5. And where you design those is you look at your list and you combine like kinds together. The smaller the group you can make them within each pillar, the easier it will be to measure it. Okay, so I would take each list that you have and see if you can combine those into 5 chunks. And then each of those chunks will have one metric associated with it.
I'm just wondering if it's accomplishable.
It's, of course it is.
Accomplishable for one metric,
For
one
one
chunk today.
It might be. Here's what we can do. Do we have a list that someone has typed up that we can read that's
Yeah,
readable?
it is in the chat right now, and I can copy paste it anywhere.
Okay.
And I'm curious if
Yeah,
you're
let's share it. Yes.
if you're talking about step 4 mostly.
No,
You
we
want
have
to
to
go from the
we
start.
have to yeah, we have to go from the start, right?
Okay.
So we have to decide which one we're focusing on, which pillar.
Okay, let's start there.
Yep.
And I will pull the data.
So which pillar would we be comfortable with?
Educational component is what was extremely well received. I would say it's critically important.
Yeah, we could focus on education, which is actually part of all 4 pillars.
I understand.
Right. So that actually would be a good nugget, if you will. I'll call it a nugget that serves as a feedback loop.
Food produce, maybe.
Pardon?
Food produce or food distribution.
Well, all 4 of these have education in them.
Yeah, I understand. Shall we choose one, food produce or food distribution? Because it seems they were.
Have a recommendation you'd like to?
I'm thinking access is the easiest. It makes the most sense. But
Okay.
if there's one that you prefer, I'm open to any one. All right. Is access one that resonates easily with you, or do you want to pick another one?
I like access.
Okay.
Yeah, access is good. Access
Okay. All right. So we can scribe right on here. All right. So we're going to do access, that particular pillar. So let's focus just on education and let's define our action question for that. And again, these notebooks are for you to scribe on. It's perfect to do this. So let's define an action question. Or before we do that, let's go into step 1. Now that we know what we're doing, let's go into step 1. Okay. So what areas are we exploring? Okay. So we know education goes across the 4. It goes across each pillar, right? So let's talk about okay, education, and we're focusing on access. So what specific things related to access do we want to focus on for education?
Would some of that be what Ahmad had put up in his comments about?
That's I copy pasted.
I would say education about food. What is food security versus insecurity would be a good one. So that's an area we could look at. So education, pardon?
Do you want it here?
Yeah, we're listing the areas to explore further. Yep. Okay. So there needs to be an element of awareness. Okay. How about underneath? Again, we're still focusing on access and education. So what about what underneath?
Access in terms of
and these are all access, just so we know. So maybe we should put access in front of that.
Folks in need actually has access. So it's back to you know, what is insecurity? People aren't getting what they need. So do we know who these people are?
Right. So here's the thing, and maybe there's some confusion here. It seems like this is a high level. We're listing areas to be explored. So we're going to say access dash education about food security versus food insecurity. Access dash the next item. Access dash the next item. So these are only specific to access, the pillar access, and education.
So
all 4 of these. What's that?
So So that's the way you want?
Well, that's how it's typically done. Yeah. So we need to know what pillar this connects to. Remember, we're going to be attempting to measure these things. So the question is, which subsystem are we focusing on?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So instead of this, right?
Right. So access dash.
Okay.
Yeah. Access dash education about food security versus insecurity. That's an area to explore. Right. And of course, there'll be a lot of things underneath that as we drill. Right.
Okay. So you
all
want
right.
it to be here.
Yeah. And then, so what's another one under access dash education? What's another one? And I think, Ramona, you just mentioned something. So we want to know the who, right?
Yeah.
That will be a question that we ask.
Okay.
Demographics.
Okay. Demographics. Yep. All right. Awesome.
Okay.
How about accessibility? So
it's access and accessibility, or just accessibility?
well, it would be access, that's the pillar, education, and accessibility to education. Access, population, demographics. Do we have a population? Do we know of a population? Does the population have access or not, right? The top one would be, education about what is food security versus insecurity. So terminology, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are all related to education. Okay, so access dash education.
So access, what Virginia was saying, access, education,
Needs assessment.
need assessment.
Okay.
So do you want it with dash?
Yeah, it can be dash. Now, needs assessment is one aspect, but does that tie into population and demographics?
Yes.
Right. So that would be pursuant to that. That would be underneath that umbrella. Would you agree? I would put needs assessment after demographics, because there's a lot of different aspects of need related to that. I think that makes sense.
In the same line?
Yeah, on line 2. Yeah. So
Okay.
slash, needs assessment. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. All right. So access education. Can you put education in front of population just so we know what subsystem and system within the subsystem we're focused on? Yeah.
So where would access versus education, where would this fall? Whether somebody, okay, let me go back to some of my notes.
Yeah, go ahead and we'll.
Whether or not access versus education buy in. In other words, do people actually want gardens and fresh food or not?
Okay.
But is that part of needs assessment?
Well, here's the thing. Needs assessment is, I think, something different. Buy-in and needs assessment, they seem the same, but they're not. Yeah. Buy-in is, I may not need it, but I support it. Right? Or I might buy in and I need it. You see what I'm saying? So well,
I think of it also in terms of, people putting in their own gardens, right? So, right. And I use me as an example. So I'm a gardener in terms of flowers. My parents worked farms. I always wanted to do vegetables, but I have and I have the buy-in is there. I just don't know from 0 to 1 what to do, and I don't want to do it.
Right.
I don't want to build. I don't have access. I have buy-in, but ultimately I need something else to actually make it happen.
Right. And I understand that, but we have to remember too that we're focusing right now on access and education. That's it. Right, in this piece.
Yeah, but in terms of education,
would that change your mind? If you became educated about it, would you buy in now?
If I would have to be educated by, yes.
Okay, so number 3 covers that.
So number 3 covers the buy.
Absolutely, absolutely. So here's the thing. When you think of access and education, you're either buying in for your own purposes or you're buying in to benefit the system in some way. So it's very high level, right? And there's going to be sub aspects to that.
I just put the 4th and 5th one
Okay,
to
so the
discuss.
4th one doesn't tie into access and education.
We
though.
can.
Okay,
We can
so
access and educate about nutrition, health, and freshness.
okay. Do you feel that belongs there?
I don't know. I'm asking.
And yeah, I'm asking the
Well, I
same.
think access and education, I agree.
Those would be the topics of the education. Yeah.
But there's also the intersection of all of them. In other
Absolutely, that's implied.
words, you're not
Remember, this is a subsystem.
right.
This is a subsystem. So anything we define here is in the access subsystem of the entire food system. So there is interdependencies, and there's also, they are interrelated. Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so we have 5 good ones, right? Is there anything you would change about anything?
Anything about human capital? No.
Well, as far as access, you mean people to do the education piece?
Education about feasibility, education about process.
Well, I mean, are you talking access to individuals to do the education?
And
Because remember, it's
discussion.
access and education. That's the,
Mhm.
yeah. And again, these are 5 great ones to start with. So
Okay.
yeah, we could always build on this. All right, so now we go to what tactical questions would you like to be able to answer to improve your organization? So these are 5 questions that you want to ask, and they should not be yes, no questions. You want to try and stay away from yes, no questions. So
you want one question per number?
nope, nope. Just think about it at the high level, right? Keeping in mind that this spreadsheet will be, this whole workbook will be for one question. So we're going to throw out some tactical questions, and then we're going to identify one out of the flock to focus on first, right? And keep in mind too that there's, 5 slots here. You could add to the slots, right? There's never just 5. So what we'll do is let's list the top 5.
So would a question be such as, what are the barriers to food access? No.
Okay. Now you would have to define barriers. So think about it this way. The question should have variables that are measurable and testable.
Oh, okay.
Okay, the variables should be operationally defined with consensus. So we would have to define barriers, right? So that's one that's going to drill down. And what we could do to make it simple for now is just focus on barriers and make 5 questions related to barriers, right? And have that discussion now.
It's good choice, I believe, about barriers.
Yeah, I do. I think so. Yeah.
So a barrier, I think one barrier would be, okay, I'm confused.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
So one barrier is lack of access.
Okay, so
Defining what a barrier is.
okay, right.
Is something, someone.
And you can do that below, Yulia. Yeah, underneath the grid. So what is a barrier?
Okay, I'm just talking out loud, right?
Yep.
I'm just brainstorming out loud. Something or someone, whether it's structural, whether it's systemic, that limits, that kind of like you were saying about meeting what's considered food security, like that's limiting the opportunity or the accessibility to eat 5 fruits or vegetables a day.
Okay, so let's think about what we're focused on right now, though. We're only looking at access and education. I know. So
okay,
think about it just in terms of access and education, that intersection, right? So the barriers.
Lack of knowledge.
Pardon?
Lack of knowledge, lack of education is a barrier.
Lack of awareness. Okay. All right. So all right. So lack of awareness, right? So the question we would be asking related to lack of awareness is what? And think about it from the first thing. Have to have variables that are measurable and testable.
How many people?
How
are-
many, right? Think of percentages. What percentage?
Measure awareness.
So you could say it in terms of what percentage of individuals
Mhm.
are aware of the difference between food security and food insecurity.
Oh.
Right? So now you can define food security and insecurity. That's something you'll need to do. That's another variable. And you have a quantifiable metric, which is the percentage of individuals, right? You could break that down even further and focus on location. So you could say in this particular geographical area, right? So you can get even more granular with this. All right. When you're surveying and you're collecting the data, you can say, let's break it down by location. And we're going to focus on these separate regions in Newburgh as locations of interest. You see what I'm saying? So now your percentage of individuals is broken down or grouped by region. Okay. You could also make it based on
We had census tracts. Back in the day, there were certain census tracts that we knew included more people of poverty who were impoverished.
Right, right. Exactly. It's that same principle.
Okay.
All right. So these questions that you're asking, you can tie it to other, you can tail it off by looking at location. You could even look at a specific community. So let's say you focus on just after school programs. You could focus just on, houses of worship. You could focus on just certain areas as well. So you could break it down even further. The more granular you get, the better. But right now, this high level question is a tactical one that you could tie a demographic to, is the point I'm trying to make. Okay. All right. So the second question will be, what would be a second question? So the demographic piece, we can tie to that. What we want to do is keep it high level at this point, right? So what's the second question? And truthfully, you could do what's the percentage, you can actually make that question for each one of these. I would be careful that you don't just go with percentages, but you can. That's up to you.
What would be another measurement?
Well, another measurement would be relational in nature.
Whoa.
So is there a relationship between X and Y? All right. And those are more difficult questions, but those are very important questions.
So is there a relationship between poverty? Can we say that? Because we have the index. So
okay. So remember, we're talking about access and education now. So what was your question? Well, is there a relationship between?
Because one of the questions we need to understand in Newburgh is around whether or not we are really, there's in food security or insecurity.
Right. Which is a function of income level.
Which is a function of income level.
Okay.
One of that is income level.
Okay. So is there a relationship between income level and food insecurity? And I think we can answer that easily. So that one's kind of a yes, no, I would say.
Maybe food, fresh food awareness.
Well, why don't we look at other pieces of, how about buy-in?
I was thinking of that.
How about buy-in?
Because that's really important.
Right. So why don't you make that one, Yulia? Is there a relationship between income level and buy-in? Okay. Because we can automatically say that if your income level's low, your food security is going to be low. I mean, that's a pretty easy one, right? Yeah. Okay, perfect.
And because that's what ties into whether or not we need more more engagement, community engagement in communities that
Right.
have low income communities.
Right. And there's a specific analysis that we won't go into tonight that will tap into this. What's really key is that you need to define your income level, right? In other words, income level would be addressed as a variable, buy-in would be defined and subsequently addressed. And if community engagement is a second one, I would make that a separate question. Because if you're looking at X and Y, yeah, I would make that a separate question.
Between income level?
Well, if you would do, is there a relationship between income level and community engagement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, the other thing to think about, which again, I know it's late and people are probably like, oh my God, my brain hurts, is you could also look at two variables and the Y. The Y would be the X that, or I'm sorry, what you're basically looking at, the dependency is. So here, if we say, if there's a relationship between income level and community engagement, community level is the X and community engagement is a Y, on the Y axis, okay?
Yeah.
You could also look at two variables as X's and the Y as the dependent variable. So that's something else to think about. Right?
Because then you can make a connection between buy-in and community engagement.
That's correct. Right. And here's the thing.
Did you already say that?
I did, but I was alluding to buy-in, but again, it's something that you want to have a sort of a hypothesis about. There could be definitely a relationship between, income level and buy-in and community engagement, but you have to define, what are we attempting to predict? If we have low buy-in and low income level, are we predicting low community engagement? That's a logical progression, right?
Yeah.
Conversely, if we have high income or medium income, medium buy-in, what if we have low engagement? What does that mean? Or what if we have high engagement, right? So what you're basically determining, is there a statistically significant relationship? And if there is, then you would want to cultivate income level. Obviously, that's a problem none of us can solve, right? To get the income level higher. And then buy-in, which could be a function of education, and subsequently now you have increased engagement. So we
want the community income levels to increase, which then translates into education in the schools, right?
Right. So here's the thing, though. What we're talking about, though, is let's say there's not enough jobs with the skill set that individuals have that they can get, right? So now you might identify a community dynamic that is preventing this system from flourishing, and maybe it's down to, we need to have more jobs with the skill set that individuals in this community have. And maybe you might determine, hey, let's pay someone a minimum wage to work with the gardens, or provide some, after school programs or what have you. So you start to identify different things that we could increase community engagement if we had these things. Let's say buy-in is a factor, and I'm not going to buy in because my income's too low. Now the income goes up, I buy in, and community is engaged. And it actually is perpetuating itself.
Or like Ahmed said, the income is just not accessible. Meaning, if there are stores throughout the city, but the stores aren't offering healthy vegetables,
right?
And I have a buy-in, my income is low, but there's something else that's not offering what I need.
Right. So here's the thing. That goes back to accessibility. It's not in my store, right? So that would not necessarily be an education thing.
Right.
That would be right. But I see exactly what you're saying, but those are connected, right? Exactly. So right now we're focusing on just access and education, but that definitely in another pillar would be.
But it is education, because I still have to know that the value of having my 5 fruits and vegetables a day.
Okay, so let me ask this question then.
I have to know that to then be able to go to the store and either it's there or it's not.
Right. Right.
Not there, then the buy-in piece says, for me, is then how do I advocate for it?
Okay, so let's look at it this way.
All right.
Here's the thing, access and education is what we're looking at. So access to produce is not education, right?
Right.
And so what I was thinking based on what you just said is educating the grocer and providing.
Yeah, that too.
Okay, so is there a relationship between produce supply and community engagement?
Well, part of community engagement is engaging. Okay.
So think of it this way. I could be that local grocer and I believe in what you're doing. I know it's necessary, and for some darn reason, I'm just not providing vegetables in my store. And that could be just a function of connecting the dots, right? So I'm curious is if and I whoop, it went away. Oh no.
We'll do it.
I would say
Well,
if
I
we're
think it's a function of also, I don't know that that's what anybody wants.
exactly, but is it access and education? You see what I'm saying? So that would go into educating the supplier, which is what I was getting at. Okay, so telling them what is needed, telling them what, so why don't we create a question about
Well, let me ask you one more thing. But the buy-in, would the buy-in for the supplier be contingent on the
education?
education of the people, because the supplier needs to know that they know to come.
Yes, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. So the people on the block have to go in and say, hey, why don't you have veggies?
Right.
Okay. So there's two aspects to that.
There's two components to that.
That's correct. There's the customer and the supplier. So
relationship that I have to know to tell you I want vegetables.
they have to know to articulate what their needs are. Okay.
Yes.
So why don't we make it about that? Because I think that's super important.
Okay.
So is there a relationship between customer requests or customer, let's see here,
customer education and advocacy? In other words, if I'm educated, then I know to go to the grocery store and say, hey, this is what I want.
That sounds good. I like that question. Yeah. And advocacy could be a whole thing, a whole bunch of things, right? I tell a few friends, or it could be, I tell my grocer, this is what I want. I tell, I tell the babysitter that, hey, we need to be feeding, better veggies, better snacks than the after school snacks, right? Or something along. So advocacy is a nice umbrella. I like that one. Yeah. I think that works. Number 3. So let's see. Is a relationship between produce supply and community engagement. All right. So we kind of did in 5. I think we covered education, advocacy. And that is kind of the inverse. Okay. So we could have a lot more questions here.
Ooh.
Yeah. Hey, yes. As you know, so let's check and make sure our questions meet the requirements. On the right, the questions should have variables that are measurable and testable. Do they have that? Yes, right? Let's look at the first one. What are the variables?
Percentage of individuals.
Okay, the individuals are the variable, right? The measurable is the percentage, right? So that we could test that, right? And individuals, have we defined what they are? Who are these individuals? Because that could be the grocer too.
So then we need to population.
Put them in a parentheses. It could be
I
It
would
could
say consumer or supplier,
be
right?
consumer or supplier.
You want either one or you want both?
I would say both are important.
both.
Yeah,
Well, because if you're, yeah,
right. So you could maybe wrap that around if it's getting out of control. We're just, but yeah, I would say consumers and suppliers, both is very important. Remember, when you're going out and you're assessing the community, you're going to be looking at core groups of individuals. You're going to be looking at those who supply and those who consume. And that goes back to supply and demand. Those two, common things. All right, so how about the second one? Is there a relationship between income level and buy-in? Well, income level we can define, right? We can just do it by, ranges, and buy-in, we need to define that. So how would we define buy-in? Now, buy-in could be measured looking at a percentage of impact points with the system. So buy-in could be defined in a multitude of ways.
How do you want to define it?
Yeah. If someone says, yeah, I think it's great that you're offering this thing, that's not necessarily buy-in. Buy-in is behavioral. So if they are part of a community garden,
so
there's
like,
buy-in.
like on a Likert scale, when you say like, how likely are you to?
Yep.
One.
Perfect. So if you're using a Likert scale, right? And so that would be a way of measuring buy-in. The other thing to think about, though, is you could ask that question to your supplier. How likely are you to participate in the supply of fresh vegetables from the community garden, right? So buy-in is going to go in the supplier and the consumer, right? Both sides there.
Now, I have a question for Virginia, though. Can we do that? Can you, does that go against NUFFI's mission? Because once we start dealing with suppliers and they're selling food, then that's a whole nother, now you're talking about profit and commercial selling, as opposed to what we do now, which is free food to people who need and want it.
Good question.
Yeah, I think we want to be very clear that the project that we're doing is for the entire city and for everyone out there. NUFFI's mission right now is to provide access to healthy food to everybody, especially those who can't afford it. But if you're looking at in terms of what we want to do with this grant and bringing about what we're saying is systemic change to the city of Newburgh, then I think we have to deal with the issue of accessibility in the for-profit also.
Yeah.
So if you go into, as I did last summer, a market on Saturday morning that was extremely busy with Hispanic people wanting to get their vegetables to go home. And the produce in the store was awful, really awful stuff. And many of these people are probably working on the farms in Orange County that are growing this healthy, wonderful vegetables, but it's not in the stores where they're shopping. So the disconnect, and it's, to me, if you buy it or you get it, it should be fresh and it should be healthy.
Yeah.
Or what? And, it's like when people start talking about the local meats issue, do you go into the store and ask your butcher, where did you get that meat from? Was it from a farm in the Hudson Valley, or at least in the region? And I think that's what we want to start asking overall in the food system.
So local sourcing locally.
Sourcing. How fresh is it?
Yeah.
And if it's not grown on our farm or one of the community gardens, there's a lot of agriculture in our region. And why are people looking at stuff that's basically dead? It should go into compost and having to have access to that.
And they're paying premium for it because
Probably, because it's a
Right.
small store. It's where they normally go and shop because it's, it's set up for them. And it's in the neighborhood where they can walk and easily get to,
Mm,
but it's dead produce.
Yep.
There's
Yep.
nothing good about it. So I think with this grant that we're going after, our hope is to make sure that whether you go in a store or you go to a pantry or you come to the farm or whatever, you have access to the freshest, most healthy food that can be provided.
So I'm curious, then it would logically follow then, if Joe Grocer is selling, crappy vegetables and he's paying for it, right? Why not have him get his supply from the farm? And now you have that, you're providing exactly what the farm is producing, and you're not getting it from wherever you're getting it from, days old and what have you. There has to be an impetus. That's part of the buy-in, where the supplier now buys from or sources it from the garden. Is that a thing?
Well, I think it goes to Ramona's point. We are a not-for-profit farm.
Right.
We're a not-for-profit organization.
Right.
There are for-profit farms in Orange County and the surrounding area. Those farmers have to make a living.
Right.
We're not in competition with them.
Right.
Dollars for many of
Right.
the stores.
Right.
We could certainly put that grocer in touch with some very healthy growers in the region. So I think, again, what we are doing off of that farm right now as a not-for-profit and not competing with the for-profit farms is important to a specific population in the city of Newburgh.
Right.
Educating the grocers about accessing fresh produce from those farmers who may be going to New York City now because they don't have a market close by.
Right.
So can we build markets for them?
So that's part of access and education. Absolutely. But on the supplier side. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. So,
but you know what? I don't know if that's distribution, because let's say we have a farm, Virginia and everyone else, but they have a market in New York City. So is there like less than product going to the city of Newburgh?
Well, they don't come to Newburgh right now because they're not making enough money to come to the city of Newburgh.
right.
If there were markets in the city of Newburgh where they could sell their produce and make a living, then yes, they would sell in the city of Newburgh.
Well, then my question is, where are these suppliers in the city of Newburgh getting these crappy vegetables from?
They're getting them from wholesale distributors.
Right.
They're getting them from the big major or smaller wholesale distributors.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
And they only continue to do that because people are buying it. So there is that supply and demand. Even though the supply is crappy, people are still buying it because that's just what
That's all there is. Yeah. That's all there
Yeah.
is. Yeah. Well, again, we're focusing on access and education. And I think if we just focus on the supplier and educating them as to what's available,
Yeah.
and not necessarily, stepping on their toes as far as, competition and all that. Do you see it as something, and this is just a curiosity question, where a grocer knows that a certain population of individuals might come into a store and they can't afford to purchase vegetables? Do you see it as something where they might offer a basket of, free, if you're hungry, eat kind of deal, where, they come in and they don't have enough money, or they only have so much money, and but we have a basket from the farm that's here that was donated that you can avail yourself to? Is that something that, and again, this is just off the top of my head.
I think that part of the discussion has to be with the market,
Right.
and providers, and looking at what may be some innovative models
Mhm.
that are happening in other communities
Yep.
that have addressed this issue, and there's some major communities that have addressed this issue already.
Right.
And to look at maybe some of those discussions.
Okay. So those are things to think about for future. So I think we have 5 questions that are very relevant. Keep in mind that this is not an exhaustive list. There's plenty more, but for now we've got some stuff we can chew on, right? So then what we would do is go to the next step in the spreadsheet. All right, and Yulia, since you're sharing, I'm hoping you if you can go to step 2.
Whew.
I know. Hey, this is hard work. Let me tell you.
Yeah, for somebody who's a novice at it, it's hard.
It is, and keep in mind that yeah, I can't, let's put it this way. I can't make it simple for you. It is what it is. But when you invest the time and effort into it, the rewards are through the roof. So this is part of the process. But you will have definitive things that you can measure, and you will see things, you'll start to see patterns in your data that will be very revealing and will provide insight. And at the end of the day, you know, when I've worked on projects like this prior, you always think about the end result, the mission of the organization. You loop right back to why are we doing this in the first place? And, you know, so that makes some of the tiredness and the tediousness and all that kind of, you know, it's for a good cause, it's for a good thing. And you might even come up with a model that you could then help other communities implement, you see? So that's the other piece of it. You know, you have something, you have a model that's been implemented, designed, implemented, tested, and replicating that success. All right, so Yulia, we got some questions down. Are we going to go to step 2, or are we going to hold off? Or it's a 8:15.
Yes,
We
and
might
I have a
need.
hard stop.
Yes, yes. So what would you say next steps? Because we're obviously, what would you envision?
Again, for educational purposes, for understanding how does this work, it was really helpful for everyone. It brought so much clarity and literally
Well, I think
measurement.
for me, and you know, Virginia has so much more knowledge about what's happening citywide, but never once in my conversation, you know, when I'm, yakking, did I ever think about the suppliers, not the
Right.
actual store suppliers. We've talked about the suppliers in terms of food coming from the food bank to, to the, so supplier are the food banks. The supplier then becomes of one of the soup kitchens or one of the pantries. Supplier is, the farm, but a supplier is also the corner store.
That's right. That's right. And a very vital aspect of the community. So you want to definitely think about it in terms of consumer, supplier, or producer consumer model, right? And supply is part of that equation, most definitely.
Yeah.
It's a classic model. Yes.
So for me, I think it's really big piece of this research if the grant would be received, and that's where it would be very much applicable. But at least right now for this specific grant proposal, you have the definition what you want to achieve, and you can just speak about 4 pillars and at least address specific outcomes in under each pillar, if it makes sense.
Right. And I would quantify it by saying, okay, we have our pillars. We're going to identify 5 core things that we want to measure. We're going to define them, right? We're going to then, determine whether or not we're looking at frequencies or relationships, because once you have it, once it's testable and measurable, you can then subsequently measure it. And you have to decide, where's that data coming from? How are you collecting that data? And that type of
before before and after. Let's put it this way: for the grant specific application, right now they just need to define the focus, what they will be trying to achieve, And if grant received, then all these data driven would be
Yes.
applicable.
Right.
But at least through this conversation, we make it so clear. And so otherwise, before that, it was like all over. We were talking about everything. It was mess. But I think right now, when everything is so structured on the buckets, we can create as many buckets, more detailed as we want. But
But
for the specific grant application, just emphasize a few and say, we will dig deeper. We will get the data. We will be having the
that's what I
team
was thinking.
efforts.
Right. Right.
We can
Yeah.
hone on a few, Virginia, hone in on a few, but this process is really, when we're talking about a master plan, this
Right.
process of creating the questions and the
Right.
analytics and the measurement tools and the everything,
Right.
that's big.
It is big, and that's secondary to the plan.
All of that to move into the planning
That's right.
process.
That's right. That's
The
right.
actual implementation, but we have
Right.
to know all of that.
Right. So you're deciding what it is. What is the plan? What's the essence of the plan? And that's where the pillars are essential. Okay.
Right.
Not a problem, Yulia. Not a problem. Yes. So I hope that makes sense. And here's the thing, I haven't seen the grant, so it appears it's, at the input side of things, right? But having a plan and keeping it so it directly, the feedback loop goes right back to the mission of the organization. That's a no-brainer, right? It's like a strategic plan, right? Now you've got those 4 pillars within that plan. And you can logically group things as you need to. And obviously there's goals and objectives that for each of those subsystems that you would have that are general in nature at this point. You would then measure the extent to which you meet those goals with the metrics, right? So just, I think, letting them know at this juncture that you have a performance measurement mechanism, that it will be data driven. That's what they want to hear, is that is
I agree.
right. But a high level, it sounds like they don't want any level of granularity. You have a process, and that definitely, you can articulate. So is there anything else that for the purposes of where you're at with the grant that we can work on really quick, or so this is due Friday?
Uh-huh.
Oh
Yep.
my goodness.
Yep.
Okay, well, is there anything else that a gap that we can fill in to facilitate the Friday deadline?
No, I think we're moving ahead. We're doing quite well, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I hope this process has been helpful. I know it's an arduous process and it is quite comprehensive.
The CFA grant?
This is not a CFA, am I right, Virginia?
No, it's not a CFA. No. This is a USDA
Yeah.
and then Natural Resource Conservation Services grant.
It's just a familiar deadline.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is really
Jared.
amazing that USDA would ask farming communities to come in during the height of the season to
Right.
look at grants.
Yeah. It's not necessarily easy at times. All right. Well, I presume that down the road we might need to reconvene to have a further, more granular discussion on the data part. I hope that spreadsheet that I've provided at least gets you in the mindset of, planning. It's an iterative process. So, and very time consuming, and focusing on one pillar at a time is very beneficial too. And having a whole team to do it is also helpful. Because there's so many things to consider.
Right.
You don't want to be doing this by yourself. So
No.
that's definitely important.
Virginia, you have the template, right? I'm having trouble opening it right now, but you have it, right?
Yeah, it was sent via email. Are you checking your email, Ramona?
No, I'm checking the template that
You mean with the bit.ly link?
Yeah.
Okay, let me see here. Let me try to access it. We have so many notes in here. It's awesome. Okay, let's see here.
I want the one with Leah's notes in them.
Okay, that she probably, because that's in Google Drive, she should have shared it.
Yeah, that's the one I'm not opening. It's
Okay, let me see if I can do
Chat.
that.
I was trying to open it. Yeah, it's in a Google Drive. For some reason on my computer, it's not opening.
Yeah, it's opening on mine. So I'm just curious.
Asking Virginia, are you able to open it, Virginia?
I don't have what the fill-in is. I only have the one. Well, let me not do that. No, I do have it. Yes.
Yeah, so the link, yeah, is to Google Drive, and it is openable. I'm able to open it.
Ramon, it's got different pages.
Yeah, I'm not opening it on for what
Okay.
reason. It could be it doesn't matter. As long-
Okay, yeah. So the one that's in Google Drive is the one that, Yulia was working on during the session here. If you aren't able to open it, you can always email and it can be sent directly, which is fine. Sometimes computers, right?
Right.
Say no more, right? Just
Leave it.
and mine's talking to me because I said the C word. I said computer, and she's like, "Wait a minute, are you talking about me?" I have a robot here. Oh, all right. I'm gonna wrap up the recording, but before I do, I just want to say that it's been wonderful to work with you folks on this project, and I do wish you all the best with moving the grant forward. And I hope this process has been helpful. If you have any questions, obviously you can reach out. And that we'll gladly help you with any questions that you have. Do you have any questions that you want to ask right now before we wrap up? Besides your brain going, it's a labor of love, remember, right? Whether you're gardening or you're talking about gardening, it's a labor of love.
I'm trying to think for Virginia to answer the question, and she's not out loud, was this helpful for her? Because she's doing most of the writing.
Yes.
And
No, this was very helpful. And I think we need to share it with Styles also.
yes.
Okay, wonderful. I'm so glad. And again, you might think of things afterward. I definitely encourage you to jot, and if I can just offer this little piece of advice, think of it as a system with subsystems. And, if you have to parallel it to your own body, and, sometimes your brain says, well, wait a minute, am I talking about the subsystem or the system? Just think of it as the human body, and, what happens when one system needs to be considered and nothing else, but knowing that it ties into the whole, right? And that makes it the easiest. And so I'm very glad it was helpful.
I like to see the visual. Oh.
Exactly. And also, take advantage of graphics to create the right. So, and I'm sure you have, but that's sometimes the visual helps. The words kind of make your brain go to sleep. Just having the visual that breaks it down really helps. So and when you're communicating it to stakeholders as well, which is always a good thing. All right. Well, I am so glad this was helpful.
Right. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And I will be stopping the recording now, and we will share it with you afterwards.